A Puritan winter, February 1692. The snow lay deep across the Massachusetts coast, and the village of Salem crouched beneath it like a hunted thing. 3 generations had hacked farms from the forest here, yet every man carried the memory of last autumn when Wabanaki war parties had struck the northern frontier, burning Haverhill and carrying off women and children. Smallpox had followed the refugees south, and fresh graves dotted the hillside cemetery like pockmarks on the earth itself. Into this crucible of fear walked the Reverend Parris, 40 years old, Harvard-educated. He had failed as a merchant in Barbados and now clutched at ministry as salvation. The villagers had quarreled for 2 years over his appointment, and the salary dispute still festered like an open wound. Parris brought with him his wife Elizabeth, their daughter Betty, aged 9, and his niece Abigail Williams, of 11. More ominously, he brought Tituba and John Indian, enslaved people he had purchased in Barbados. Tituba, likely of Arawak or African descent, became the household cook and caretaker for the children, carrying in her memory the voodoo practices of the Caribbean plantations. The long winter evenings stretched before them like eternity itself. Each Sabbath, Parris delivered sermons that lasted 3 hours, warning that Satan prowled the colony like a roaring lion, seeking whom he might devour. The congregation fasted twice weekly, their stomachs growling louder than the wind that rattled the window shutters. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams spent those winter days spinning and sewing, but their minds wandered to Tituba's stories. She told them of magic practiced on distant islands, of spirits that could be summoned with the right words and gestures. The girls began to experiment with fortune-telling, using an egg white and water to divine their future husbands. Then came the fits. Betty started first, twisting her body into unnatural shapes, choking on invisible hands, babbling words no one understood. Abigail soon followed, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed, her mouth foaming with strange sounds. The local physician, Dr. William Griggs, could find no natural cause. "The evil hand is upon them," he declared, and the word spread through the village like wildfire. The lion had found his prey. The first day of March, 1692, dawned iron cold over Salem Village. Snow still clung to the eaves of the meeting house, and smoke rose in thin spirals from every chimney as the bells summoned the magistrates. Inside, benches had been pushed aside to make room for a makeshift court. 2 long tables formed a hollow square, and every taper in the village seemed pressed into service, throwing restless shadows on the whitewashed walls. At the center stood Tituba, the enslaved woman from Reverend Parris's household, her dark hands clasped tight. Beside her hunched Sarah Good in a threadbare cloak, belly swollen with the child of a man who had already abandoned her. Sarah Osborne, once a woman of property, now trembled with palsy and shame, her gray hair escaping from a linen cap. Magistrates John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin took their seats, quills and inkwells before them like weapons. Spectators crowded every inch of floor, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Among them pressed the afflicted girls. Betty Parris, only 9, clutched her cousin Abigail Williams by the sleeve. Hathorne's voice cracked like a whip. "Tituba, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" At first she denied everything, her voice barely above the hiss of the tapers. But hour followed frigid hour, and the magistrates' questions grew sharper, the crowd's murmurs darker. Finally, under the weight of expectation and fear, Tituba's story changed. She spoke of a tall man from Boston dressed in black, who came to her with black dogs and yellow birds. He forced her to sign a great book, bound in black leather, she said, and to pinch the afflicted girls when they would not obey. Gasps rippled through the room like wind through dry leaves. The girls responded instantly. Betty Parris screamed that Tituba's yellow bird was biting her. Abigail cried out that she could see the black dogs circling, their bodies twisted in impossible angles, and no man present dared call it play acting. Sarah Good, when questioned, snarled that Osborne was worse than she. Osborne, confused and weeping, could only mumble that she had given ground to the devil by skipping church. Each accusation fed the next, a fire devouring fresh timber. By nightfall, warrants were scratched and signed. The 3 women were led to the small jail behind the meeting house, chains clanking against the frozen ground. But the village could not sleep. In every house, Parents barred doors and whispered that the devil walked abroad in Massachusetts. The next Sabbath, Reverend Parris preached on the text, "Have not I chosen you, 12, and one of you is a devil?" His voice trembled with righteous fury, and not a single soul missed the message. Tituba's confession had lit a fuse that no water could quench. Within days, new names were cried out by the afflicted. Rebecca Nurse, pious grandmother of 20. Giles Corey, stubborn old farmer who had once sued half the village. Bridget Bishop, tavern owner with a reputation for bright ribbons and loud laughter. The law, once a slow and careful thing, now sprinted to keep pace with nightmare. Magistrates met daily, sometimes hourly, scratching warrants by candle stub. Yet the more they questioned, the more the circle widened until every shadow seemed to hide a witch's face. By the end of March, the jail at Salem town groaned with prisoners, and still the fits came thicker. The village had stepped through a door that would not swing shut for 13 terrible months. 27th of May, 1692. The morning tide carried Governor William Phips back into Boston Harbor, sails sagging with the weight of English rain and royal orders. Word flew ahead of him along the post road. The jails were bursting, the fits were spreading, and the colony was screaming for justice. Phips had barely stepped ashore when Reverend Cotton Mather pressed a sheaf of petitions into his hand, ink still damp with fear. The governor, a rough-hewn sea captain turned politician, listened to the rising chorus and felt the ground shifting beneath his boots. On the 27th day of May, he signed the commission that would darken Massachusetts for a generation, a court of Oyer and Terminer, literally to hear and determine, with powers over life and death. Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man whose piety was matched only by his ambition, accepted the appointment with the solemn conviction that he was waging war against Satan himself. Beside him rode Judge Samuel Sewall, diary tucked in his saddlebag, already rehearsing the moral justifications he would later spill across page after page of anguished ink. They traveled the rutted road from Boston to Salem town beneath a sky bruised with late spring storms, the very earth seeming to mutter warnings beneath iron-shod hooves. When they reached the meeting house on the first day of June, the air inside was thick with sweat, candle smoke, and the sour smell of dread. Spectral evidence, visions seen by the afflicted alone, was ruled admissible, a decision that opened a door no man could close. The judges reasoned that the devil could assume the shape of the innocent, yet they trusted the eyes of teenagers writhing on the floor as though hell itself pressed down upon them. Bridget Bishop was summoned first, her reputation already tattered by years of gossip and the bright red bodice she dared to wear to Sunday meeting. Witness after witness told of her specter pinching and choking them in the night, of birds that flew from her fingertips, of milk soured the instant she passed a farmer's gate. She protested her innocence, voice cracking, but the circle had closed. On the second day of June, the jury took only minutes to pronounce her guilty. Staunton's gavel fell like a judge's sword. 8 days later, at high noon on the 10th of June, Bridget Bishop stood on Gallows Hill, the wind whipping her gray hair across her face. The Reverend Nicholas Noyes offered a final prayer while the condemned woman stared past him toward the distant blue line of the coast she would never see again. When the drop fell, a collective gasp rose from the crowd, half horror, half relief, as though the rope had yanked the entire colony into a darker future. That night, Cotton Mather wrote to a friend that the first blow had been struck against the kingdom of Satan, yet even he felt the tremor of doubt. The court of Oyer and Terminer had tasted blood, and its appetite was only beginning to grow. The noose had barely stopped swinging when the accusations began to spread like wildfire through the summer-dry fields of Essex County. Within days of Bridget Bishop's execution on June 10th, the courtroom at Salem town became a theater of the damned. Judge William Stoughton, his powdered wig askew from the heat, watched as the afflicted girls writhed and screamed, their eyes rolling back to show only white. The first name that pierced the summer air like a blade was Rebecca Nurse. The 71-year-old grandmother, so deaf she cupped her ear to hear testimony, had lived 40 years in Salem Village without a whisper of scandal. But when the girls pointed trembling fingers at her, crying that her specter had pinched and choked them, even her saintly reputation crumbled like ancient parchment. 40 neighbors, risking their own safety, signed a petition defending her character. "We have known her many years," they wrote, and never saw anything in her carriage unbecoming a gospel professor. But the jury, swayed by the girl's theatrical convulsions, returned a guilty verdict. When the verdict was read, Rebecca stood silent for a moment, then lifted her voice in a question that would haunt Salem forever. "O Lord, help me! I am as innocent as the child unborn." The executions continued through the sweltering days of July. Sarah Good, her infant daughter clinging to her ragged dress, went to her death still proclaiming her innocence. Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who had condemned her, taunted her to confess, but she turned on him with words that chilled the blood. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." The terror reached new heights when the name of George Burroughs was spoken. The former Salem Village minister, now preaching in Maine's wilderness churches, was dragged back in chains like some ancient prophet. Standing barely 5 feet tall, this small man with piercing eyes was accused of being the ringleader of Salem's witches, of baptizing converts in the devil's name at midnight gatherings. Cotton Mather, writing by candlelight in his Boston study, felt the weight of souls pressing upon his conscience. In his cases of conscience, he warned the judges about spectral evidence. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. Yet he defended the trials publicly, creating a moral contradiction that would stain his legacy for centuries. The contagion spread faster than smallpox. Children accused parents, husbands accused wives, neighbors who had shared bread and salt now pointed fingers across garden fences. By August, every jail from Boston to Ipswich overflowed with the accused. Women nursed babies in crowded cells while awaiting trial, their husbands' farms lying fallow, cattle wandering untended through abandoned fields. The harvest moon rose over a landscape of fear. Fields that should have been heavy with wheat stood uncut, their golden heads drooping like mourners. Children walked to school in groups, afraid to be alone. Every shadow might conceal the devil. Every neighbor might be a witch. On August 19th, George Burroughs stood on the same scaffold where Bridget Bishop had died. As the crowd watched in terrible silence, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, a feat the crowd believed impossible for a witch. Some began to murmur that an innocent man was about to die, but Cotton Mather, riding up on horseback, quieted them with reminders that the devil could appear as an angel of light. The rope snapped tight, and another innocent soul departed the world. But as the body hung limp in the summer air, something shifted in the watching crowd. The same people who had cheered Bridget Bishop's execution now stood in uneasy silence. The torrent of names was beginning to wash away the foundations of Salem itself. The morning of 19th September 1692 dawned gray and heavy over Salem town, as if the sky itself could no longer bear the weight of what men were about to do. Giles Corey, 80 years old, and stubborn as the granite hills he once cleared, stood before Sheriff George Corwin with his jaw set like iron. The charge of witchcraft hung in the air between them like a curse. But Corey knew something the sheriff did not expect. If he pleaded guilty or not guilty, his farm, 400 acres of good Essex County land, would be confiscated by the crown. His sons would inherit nothing. So the old farmer stood mute. Judge William Stoughton's face flushed crimson with fury. "The prisoner will be pressed until he pleads," he declared. The ancient punishment of peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, had not been used in Massachusetts for 50 years. They stripped Giles Corey naked in the prison yard, his old body bearing the scars of a lifetime's hard labor. Sheriff Corwin ordered a wooden plank placed upon his chest. Then came the stones. One by one, carefully, methodically, the sheriff's men began their grim work. All morning they worked, and into the afternoon. The weight grew unbearable. First 50 pounds, then 100, then 2. Corey's ribs cracked like dry kindling, yet each time they asked for his plea, he gasped the same 2 words. "More weight," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the creaking plank. "More weight," he said again, louder now, a defiant cry against the madness that had seized his colony. The sheriff's men hesitated, glancing at one another with growing unease. But Stoughton had given his order, and the stones kept coming. 300 pounds, 400. Corey's tongue protruded from his mouth, purple and swollen. Still he would not yield. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Giles Corey's spirit finally broke free of its tortured cage. His last breath escaped his lips in a final, ragged whisper. "More wait," became his epitaph, carved not in stone, but in the memory of every soul who witnessed that terrible day. 2 days later, on the 22nd of September, 8 more innocents walked the path to Gallows Hill. Among them was Martha Corey, Giles's wife, condemned by the same court that had murdered her husband. Mary Easty followed, whose sister Rebecca Nurse had already swung from these same gallows. The crowd that gathered was different now. No cheers greeted the condemned. No jeers mocked their final moments. The torrent of names had washed away something vital in Salem's soul. As the 8 bodies hung lifeless in the autumn air, Cotton Mather watched from his horse, his face ashen. Judge Samuel Sewall, who had condemned them all, stood with bowed head. Even the stern William Stoughton seemed to shrink within his robes. The witchcraft trials had claimed 20 lives now, 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death. But Giles Corey's defiant death had begun to crack the foundation of fear that had built this house of horrors. The weight of those stones, and the weight of innocent blood, would prove too heavy even for Salem to bear. October had come to Massachusetts Bay, and the first frost silvered the thatched roofs of Salem Village like a warning. Inside the meeting house, the air was thick with wood smoke and suspicion, yet a new sound threaded through the silence, the creak of conscience. Judge Samuel Sewall, once resolute, now found the ink on the warrants he signed blotting beneath a trembling hand. Across Boston, Reverend Increase Mather rose in his study at Harvard Yard, candlelight catching the silver in his beard as he dipped his quill. The words he penned that night would travel faster than any messenger. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that 1 innocent person be condemned. Those sentences, printed in his small octavo tract, Cases of Conscience, spread from pulpit to tavern like wildfire. Cotton Mather, his own son, read them with a tightening throat. The younger minister had defended spectral evidence with fervor, yet even he felt the ground shifting. In Salem town, Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps, sat at her mahogany escritoire, sealing a letter with trembling fingers. "The accusations touch too close," she whispered to her husband that evening, for her own name had been murmured among the afflicted girls. Governor Phipps, fresh from the frontier wars, knew the stench of blood when it soured. He stared at the growing stack of petitions from Andover and Ipswich, begging for mercy. On the 12th day of October, 1692, he issued an order that fell upon the colony like sudden thunder. The court of Oyer and Tyrnus was suspended. No more hangings until further notice. In Boston jail, Rebecca Nurse's elderly sister, Mary Easty, pressed her palms to cold stone, feeling the first thaw of hope. Yet shame rode the wind as sharply as winter. Judge William Stoughton, furious at the governor's interference, stormed from the bench, swearing the work of justice was being undone by cowardice. But the colony itself was exhausted. Tituba, still shackled in Boston's stone jail, heard the keys rattled differently now. The guards spoke in hushed tones instead of curses. By January of the new year, Governor Phipps formally dissolved the court entirely, replacing it with a new superior court of judicature that would quietly acquit most of the remaining prisoners. Samuel Sewall stood in Boston's South Meeting House on a fast day appointed for repentance and, with voice breaking, read aloud his public apology. "I desire to take the blame and shame of it," he confessed, while the congregation wept openly. The trials ended not with triumph, nor even with clear justice, but with the hollow echo of 20 graves on Gallows Hill. Bridget Bishop's orchard stood abandoned, apples rotting on the ground, no hand daring to harvest them. Giles Corey's heavy stones lay stacked beside the jail yard, a mute monument to stubborn truth. Abigail Williams vanished from record, perhaps fled to some distant town where her spectral visions could harm no one. Elizabeth Parris, still only 12, carried nightmares that would follow her all her days. The colony passed laws for restitution, yet money could not buy back breath, and so Salem learned that fear, once loosed, devours even its own children. In the winter of 1697, 5 winters after the first accusations flew, Judge Samuel Sewall stood before the congregation of Boston South Church, his head bowed like a penitent child. The Reverend Samuel Willard read aloud Sewall's handwritten confession, the ink still fresh, admitting that the court had been grievously deceived. The judge's voice trembled as he spoke the words himself, asking God and the people to forgive his role in the shedding of innocent blood. Across Massachusetts Bay, the colony observed a day of fasting and soul-searching on January 14, 1697, as Governor William Stoughton, who had refused to sign the confession, nevertheless bowed to pressure and proclaimed public humiliation. Churches rang their bells in solemn rhythm, not for celebration, but for mourning. Money could not raise the dead, yet the General Court began paying compensation to survivors. William Good, husband of Sarah who had swung from Gallows Hill, received £30, small recompense for a life destroyed. The Nurse family fought for years to reclaim their mother's stripped farmland, finally winning back some acres in 1712. Cotton Mather, ever the apologist, published his massive history, Wonders of the Invisible World, in 1693, attempting to justify the court's actions while softening his own fiery rhetoric. Yet even he added careful qualifiers, admitting that Satan might have deceived the accusers themselves. Elizabeth Parris, now 17, still woke screaming from dreams of invisible hands clutching her throat. Her father, Reverend Samuel Parris, eventually left Salem Village altogether, his congregation having turned against him for feeding the flames. Tituba, sold away to another master to pay her jail fees, disappeared into the anonymous fog of slavery. The memory of 1692 became a ghost that walked beside every colonial gathering. When new accusations arose in other towns, magistrates remembered Salem and demanded stricter evidence. The colony learned, slowly, painfully, that fear once loosed devours even its own children. By 1715, the Massachusetts legislature reversed all attainders, officially declaring the convicted witches innocent. Yet the scars remained carved deeper than any parchment could heal. Families like the Coreys, Giles pressed to death, his wife Martha hanged, never recovered their confiscated lands. Judge Sewall wore black every January 14th for the rest of his life, a living reminder that justice miscarried cannot be buried with the dead. He placed 20 pieces of silver in the poor box each year, one for each life lost, and so Salem learned, too late, that the greatest witchcraft is the power of fear to turn neighbor against neighbor, parent against child, truth into convenient lies. The 20th century would see the colony's apology carved in stone, but no monument could speak for those whose voices were forever silenced on Gallows Hill. The morning of May 14, 1693, dawned cold over Salem town. Governor William Phips had dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer the previous October, but the damage had already taken root in the soil of Massachusetts Bay. 19 innocent souls had swung from Gallows Hill. One man, Giles Corey, had been pressed to death beneath heavy stones for refusing to plead. The Reverend Samuel Parris, whose own daughter Betty and niece Abigail had sparked the madness, found his congregation shrinking. By 1697, he was forced to resign. Judge Samuel Sewall stood before his Boston congregation on January 14, 1697, his voice breaking as he accepted responsibility for the bloodshed. Judge William Stoughton, who had condemned so many, never apologized. The colony tried to heal. In 1712, Massachusetts declared the trials unlawful. The colony paid restitution to survivors, £30 to each family of the executed. But the deeper wound remained open. 3 centuries later, Salem's story echoes through every American courtroom. The trials gave birth to safeguards we now take for granted. Presumption of innocence, rules against hearsay, the right to face one's accuser. When the United States Constitution was written in 1787, its authors remembered Salem. The Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination stands as Giles Corey's memorial. In 1957, Massachusetts formally apologized. Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible, transformed the trials into a warning against McCarthyism. The names of the innocent, Rebecca Nurse, Bridget Bishop, John Proctor, became classroom lessons. Yet the deepest lesson remains unlearned. When fear eclipses reason, any society can turn neighbor against neighbor. The innocent dead remind us that justice is fragile, and memory its only guardian. The trials ended, but the vigilance must never cease, for in every generation, Fear waits to become the new witchcraft. The stones of Gallows Hill are gone, but the ground remembers, and we, the living, must remember too.